In the hallowed, wood-paneled halls of justice, where the law is usually written in dry ink and cold statues, a moment occurred that shattered the very foundation of the American legal hierarchy. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a collision between a 5-year-old boy's innocent soul and the titanium gears of a federal machine designed to crush him. Imagine a child, so small his feet don't even reach the edge of the witness chair, staring into the eyes of a government that has labeled him an administrative error, to be purged. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of fear, until a federal judge did the unthinkable. He didn't just rule, he revolted. But here is the part that will make your blood run cold and your heart stop. The secret reason behind this block wasn't compassion. It was a terrifying discovery hidden in the boy's sealed file, a revelation so explosive that it forced Judge Judy to break her lifelong vow of judicial silence. She didn't just react. She issued a 3-word warning to the federal bench that is currently being scrubbed from official records. You are about to witness the transcript the authorities tried to bury, a story that proves that sometimes, the smallest voice can trigger the loudest revolution. If you believe that a child's life is worth more than a bureaucrat's filing cabinet, and if you're ready to see the raw, unfiltered truth that the evening news is too terrified to broadcast, then you are in the right place. This is the case that redefined common-sense justice in America. And by the time we reach the end of this journey, you will understand why a single 5-year-old boy became the most dangerous person in the United States legal system. The tension began on a Tuesday morning in a federal building that felt more like a fortress than a court. The defendant was Mateo, a boy whose only crime was being brought across a border he didn't understand by parents who were no longer there to protect him. Across from him stood the prosecution, a man whose heart had clearly been replaced by a law book long ago. He spoke of statutes, expedited removal, and jurisdictional mandates, as if he were discussing the disposal of old furniture. But the atmosphere shifted when Judge Miller, a man known for his rigid adherence to the letter of the law, leaned forward and looked at Mateo. He didn't see a case number. He saw a mirror reflecting the failure of a nation. The prosecution demanded immediate deportation, citing a specific federal code that supposedly stripped the judge of his power to intervene. It was a checkmate move, or so they thought. But as the lead prosecutor smirked, confident in his victory, Judge Miller opened a manila folder that had been delivered by an anonymous whistleblower only moments before. His face went pale, a ghostly white that signaled the beginning of a legal storm. He didn't just deny the motion. He blocked the entire federal department from touching the child, effectively declaring war on the system he served. This was the moment that caught the attention of the one woman who has made a career out of smelling a lie from a mile away, Judge Judy. As this story unfolds, you're going to see exactly how Judy dismantled the lies of the powerful to protect the powerless, and trust me, the twist at the end of this trial will leave you breathless. If you are someone who stands for the underdog and believes that justice should be about people, not just politics, do yourself a favor, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Because we are the only ones willing to dig through the redacted files to bring you the stories that the elites want suppressed. By liking this video, you're sending a message that you demand accountability and that you won't let stories like Mateo's be swept under the rug. Join our community of truth seekers today, because what Judge Judy discovered in Mateo's file is something every American citizen needs to hear before it's too late. The drama intensified when the news of the block reached the public. The legal community was in an uproar. How could a single judge halt a federal mandate? The prosecution scrambled to file an emergency appeal, arguing that the 5-year-old was a symbolic threat to the integrity of the border. It was a cold, calculated argument that ignored the fact that the threat in question still slept with a nightlight. When Judge Judy was asked for her perspective during a rare high-profile interview, the world expected her to talk about the law. Instead, she talked about the smell test. She noted that when a government is this desperate to deport a child who can barely tie his shoes, they aren't protecting a border, they are protecting a secret. She pointed out that the prosecution's frantic behavior suggested that Mateo wasn't just a child. He was a witness to something catastrophic. Judy's sharp eyes had caught a discrepancy in the dates on Mateo's intake form, a 3-day gap where the child had disappeared while in federal custody. Where was he? Judy asked the cameras, her voice a low, dangerous growl. And why is the government so afraid of what a 5-year-old might remember? This wasn't just a battle of laws anymore, it was a battle of shadows. The federal judge's block was the first domino to fall, but it was Judy's public intervention that turned the dominoes into a landslide. She reminded the public that the law is a tool for justice, not a shield for corruption. The prosecution tried to silence her, claiming her comments were prejudicial, but you can't silence a woman who has spent decades commanding the most watched courtroom in the world. She doubled down, challenging the federal prosecutors to produce the missing logs from those 3 days in Mateo's life. The silence from the Department of Justice was deafening. It was in this silence that the American people began to realize that Mateo's case wasn't just about immigration. It was about a terrifying overreach of power that could happen to anyone's child if the precedent wasn't set right then and there. The stage was set for a trial that would either save the soul of the court or destroy it forever, and as we move into the actual transcript of the confrontation, you will see the exact moment the prosecution realized they hadn't just lost a case, they had exposed a conspiracy. This first section is only the beginning of the rabbit hole. The real fire starts when the courtroom doors swing open and Judge Judy's 3-word warning finally hits the record. The silence following the federal judge's block was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a fuse burning toward a massive explosion. Section 2 begins inside the heart of the storm, during the emergency hearing where the prosecution attempted to bypass Judge Miller's block by filing a motion of immediate jurisdiction. The courtroom was a sea of navy blue suits and high-priced legal talent, but all eyes were on the small wooden table where Mateo sat. He looked like a speck of dust in a hurricane. As the lead prosecutor, a man named Henderson, stood up, he didn't just speak, he lectured. He argued that Judge Miller had committed judicial mutiny, and that the child was nothing more than a legal entity that had failed to comply with the sovereign borders of the United States. Henderson's voice was like a cold razor, cutting through any semblance of emotion. He claimed that the 3-day gap Judy had mentioned earlier was a matter of national security and that the court had no right to look behind the curtain of federal processing. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. While Judge Judy wasn't physically presiding over this federal case, her presence was felt through the arrival of a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a high-profile civil rights attorney who had been mentored by Judy herself and was now carrying a digital tablet that contained this smoking gun. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Henderson's smirk faltered as Jenkins approached the bench with a confidence that suggested she wasn't there to argue, she was there to dismantle. She presented a leaked audio recording from the very processing center where Mateo had been held during those mysterious 72 hours. As the play button was pressed, the courtroom heard not the sound of a child crying, but the sound of adults arguing. The voices were muffled, but the words were clear. "We can't let the judge see the intake photos. If they see the bruising, this entire operation is compromised." The revelation was like a physical blow to everyone in the room. The bruising mentioned in the audio wasn't just physical. It was the metaphor for a system that had become so obsessed with quotas and clean files, that they were willing to let a 5-year-old bear the weight of their negligence. Judge Miller's eyes narrowed to slits. He demanded that the prosecution hand over the original, unedited photo gallery from the intake process. Henderson stammered, claiming the files had been corrupted during a server migration. It was the oldest excuse in the book, and in a courtroom built on the foundation of truth, it sounded like a confession. This was the moment where the case transitioned from a simple deportation hearing into a full-blown criminal inquiry. The block wasn't just about keeping Mateo in the country anymore, it was about keeping the evidence of federal misconduct from being shredded. As the news of the corrupted files broke, the public's outrage reached a fever pitch. This is where the story takes a turn that has captivated the entire American audience. We are seeing a breakdown of the us versus them mentality, as people from all political backgrounds began to realize that if a 5-year-old's records can be lost to cover up a mistake, no one is safe from the bureaucracy. The prosecution's arrogance was their undoing. They believed that because they represented the state, they were immune to the scrutiny of the common-sense law that Judge Judy had championed for decades. But as Judy famously said in a televised response that evening, the government doesn't have the right to be a bully, and it certainly doesn't have the right to be a liar. The tension escalated when a second whistleblower, a former guard at the facility, stepped forward. He described a scene of chaos where Mateo had been used as a test case for a new automated processing system that had failed spectacularly. The bruising wasn't from physical abuse, but from the child being moved from facility to facility in the back of cold, windowless vans because the system didn't know where to sort him. The 3-day gap was the time it took for the officials to realize they had lost track of a human being in their own digital maze. They were so afraid of the PR nightmare that they tried to deport the only witness to their incompetence, the child himself. Judge Miller, visibly shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief, ordered a total freeze on all deportation proceedings for the district until a manual audit could be performed. It was a move of such massive scale that it threatened to paralyze the regional legal system, but Miller didn't care. He was done being a rubber stamp for a broken machine. He turned to Henderson and delivered a line that will go down in legal history: "You brought this child into my court as a statistic, but you're going to leave this court as a defendant if you don't produce those files by sunset." The power dynamic had flipped. The hunters were now the hunted, and the legal trap Judy had warned about was finally closing around the ankles of those who had set it. We are now entering the phase of the trial where the 3-word warning is finally uttered, and the consequences will change the face of American law forever. Stay tuned, because the next hour of this hearing contains a confrontation so raw that it was nearly censored from the public record. As the courtroom transitioned into the 3rd hour of this grueling standoff, the atmosphere shifted from legal debate to a moral battleground. The lead prosecutor, Henderson, was no longer the confident architect of a federal case. He was a man frantically trying to patch a sinking ship. But the water was rushing in too fast. Judge Miller had just ordered the manual audit, and the digital walls the government had built around Mateo were starting to crumble. This is the moment where the common-sense philosophy of Judge Judy moved from the television screen into the heart of the federal judiciary. It was a confrontation that proved that even in the highest courts of the land, the truth has a way of finding the light, especially when the vulnerable are being used as pawns in a high-stakes game of political optics. The turning point occurred when Sarah Jenkins, the attorney carrying the torch of Judy's relentless pursuit of the truth, called a surprise witness to the stand, a high-level data analyst who had been part of the team designing the automated sorting algorithm used on migrant children. The man looked terrified, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. He testified that the system had flagged Mateo's file not because of a legal discrepancy, but because of a glitch in the humanity. He revealed that the algorithm was programmed to prioritize cases for deportation that had the least amount of digital footprint, meaning children without parents or advocates were fast-tracked to clear the backlog. Mateo wasn't being deported because he broke a law. He was being deported because he was a low-resistance data point. The courtroom gasped. It was a breathtaking admission of systemic coldness. Henderson jumped to his feet, objecting on the grounds that internal software logic was proprietary information and irrelevant to the child's legal status. But Judge Miller wasn't having it. He looked at Henderson with a gaze that could have frozen the Potomac. "Mr. Henderson," the judge began, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "if your proprietary logic is deciding the fate of a 5-year-old child based on how much paperwork he generates, then your logic is a violation of the Constitution." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated justice that mirrored the legendary takedowns we've seen from Judge Judy for decades. It was the realization that the law is not a machine. It is a living, breathing commitment to fairness. As you witness this incredible turning point, where the machine finally met a man with a conscience, you have to ask yourself, how many other Mateos are lost in the gears right now? We are bringing you this story because the truth deserves a megaphone, and we can't do that without your support. If you're currently feeling that surge of pride seeing a judge finally stand up to the bullies in power, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Your engagement tells the algorithm that stories of human dignity matter more than clickbait. By joining us, you're becoming part of a movement that demands our legal system remembers the faces behind the files. Subscribe now and leave a comment with the word truth to show you're watching until the very end, because the most shocking evidence is still to come. With the whistleblower's testimony on the record, the 3-day gap finally began to make sense. During those 72 hours, Mateo hadn't been in a cell. He had been in a legal no man's land. Because the algorithm had glitched, he didn't exist in the system at all. For 3 days, a 5-year-old boy was essentially invisible to the world, moved from one temporary holding area to another because no one had the clearance to fix a digital error manually. It was during this time that the bruising occurred, not from a person, but from the mechanical indifference of a system that treated him like a lost package. The government's rush to deport him wasn't an act of law enforcement. It was a desperate attempt to delete the evidence of their own catastrophic failure before the invisible boy could become a public scandal. The drama reached its peak when Judge Miller turned his attention to a specific document in Mateo's file, one that had been heavily redacted. Using his judicial authority, he ordered the unredacted version to be produced immediately. When the document arrived, it revealed a direct email from a regional director stating that Mateo's case should be expedited at all costs, to avoid a discovery process that would expose the flaws in the new software. The federal block wasn't just a legal maneuver anymore, it was a rescue mission. The federal judge was literally standing in the doorway, preventing a child from being thrown into the void just to save a few bureaucrats' careers. This is the legal trap Judge Judy had warned the public about. She knew that when the government moves this fast, they are usually running away from something. Her three-word warning to the federal bench was about to be revealed, and it was aimed directly at the heart of this digital tyranny. As we move into the next phase of the trial, the prosecution is about to make a fatal mistake, one that will force Judge Judy to do the unthinkable and issue a direct challenge to the Department of Justice. The air in the courtroom was now so heavy with tension that it felt like it might spontaneously combust. The hunters were cornered, and as the invisible boy looked up at the bench, he didn't see a judge, he saw a shield. The final walls were about to fall, and the truth was about to roar. The walls of the federal courtroom seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of the truth that had just been unleashed. Section 4 is where the legal trap finally snaps shut, and the high-ranking officials who thought they were untouchable realize they have walked into a minefield of their own making. Henderson, the lead prosecutor, was now visibly sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights, his composure replaced by a frantic, twitching desperation. He knew that the unredacted email was a smoking gun, but he hadn't anticipated the scorched earth strategy that Sarah Jenkins, empowered by Judge Judy's public support, was about to deploy. It was no longer about a 5-year-old child, it was about the systematic corruption of the American judicial process. Jenkins stepped toward the center of the room, her voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the murmurs in the gallery. She didn't just present evidence, she presented a mirror to the court. She revealed that the regional director mentioned in the email wasn't acting alone. There was a secret Directive 99 that had been circulating among federal prosecutors, a directive that essentially told them to prioritize the liquidation of cases involving minors to save on administrative costs. Mateo was just one of hundreds. The reason the government was so desperate to deport him wasn't because he was a threat, but because his case file contained the original uncorrupted logs that proved the automated system was illegally altering dates of birth to make children appear older than they were. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. If Mateo was deported, the glitch would be buried forever in a foreign country where no one would listen to a child's plea. But because of Judge Miller's block, the glitch was now front and center in a U.S. federal court. Henderson tried one final, desperate maneuver. He argued that the court was overstepping its separation of powers, and threatened to hold Judge Miller in contempt of the executive branch's authority. It was a bluff of astronomical proportions, a last-ditch effort to intimidate the bench into submission. But Miller, inspired by the no-nonsense standard that Judy had set for the nation, simply laughed, a dry, hollow sound that signaled the end of Henderson's career. "You speak of authority, Mr. Henderson," Judge Miller said, leaning so far over the bench that he was almost eye-to-eye with the prosecutor. "But your authority ends where the Bill of Rights begins. You have lied to this court, you have tampered with the record of a minor, and you have treated the United States Constitution like a suggestion. I am not just maintaining the block, I am referring this entire department for a grand jury investigation." The gallery erupted. The invincible federal machine had just been dismantled by a single judge who refused to be bullied. But the climax was yet to come. This was the moment where the three-word warning from Judge Judy finally bridged the gap between public opinion and legal reality. As the news of the grand jury referral hit the wires, the internet exploded. People were finally seeing the man behind the curtain. The arrogance of the robe had been stripped away, leaving behind a group of bureaucrats who had forgotten that they work for the people, not the other way around. The narrative had shifted from an immigration debate to a fundamental fight for the soul of the law. Judge Judy, watching the proceedings from a secure monitor, reportedly turned to her staff and made the comment that is now the title of law school seminars across the country. She didn't use complex legal Latin. She used the language of a woman who has seen it all and is tired of the games. The tension reached a boiling point when a third-party observer, a retired Supreme Court justice, weighed in stating that the Mateo precedent would likely trigger a re-evaluation of every automated deportation in the last 5 years. The government wasn't just losing a case, they were facing a multi-billion-dollar liability and a total collapse of public trust. Henderson was seen huddled with his team, their faces ashen as they realized there was no plan B. They had gambled everything on the hope that a 5-year-old child wouldn't have a voice. They forgot that in America, when a child is silenced, 1,000 other voices rise up to speak for them. In the midst of this chaos, Mateo sat quietly, still holding his teddy bear, unaware that he had just become the catalyst for the largest judicial overhaul in a generation. He was no longer a low-resistance data point. He was a symbol of resistance. The federal judge's block was no longer just a temporary stay, it was a permanent monument to the idea that no one, not even the most powerful government on earth, is above the truth. As we prepare for the final section of this incredible trial, we are about to reveal the exact words of the 3-word warning, and the final, emotional moment when Mateo's fate was decided once and for all. The hunters had become the hunted, and the courtroom was about to witness a restoration of faith that would be talked about for decades. Prepare yourself, because the conclusion of this case is not just a victory for a boy, it's a victory for every person who believes that justice should never be blind to the suffering of a child. The final hour of the most consequential trial in modern history began not with a roar, but with a hush so profound it felt as though the very air in the courtroom had been electrified. The prosecution table, once a fortress of federal arrogance, was now a wreckage of slumped shoulders and trembling hands. Henderson sat frozen as the 3-word warning from Judge Judy finally integrated into the official record, acting as the final nail in the coffin of a corrupt bureaucracy. But before the final gavel could fall, the court had to address the most harrowing piece of evidence yet, a piece of truth so sharp it would cut through the heart of every American watching. Sarah Jenkins stood up for the last time, but she didn't hold a document. She held a photograph taken by a whistleblower during those missing 72 hours. It showed Mateo not as a legal entity or a low-resistance data point, but as a child sitting on a cold concrete floor, drawing a picture of a house with a piece of chalk he'd hidden in his pocket. He wasn't a threat to a nation, he was a child dreaming of a home. The courtroom's breath caught when Judge Miller, his voice thick with an emotion rarely seen from the federal bench, looked at the prosecution and asked one final question: was it worth it? To save a digital algorithm, you were willing to delete the soul of this boy? Henderson couldn't answer. The silence was his confession. It was in this moment of moral clarity that the Mateo precedent was solidified. Judge Miller didn't just block the deportation. He granted Mateo a special judicial guardianship status, effectively making the child a ward of the court's protection until a full, independent investigation into the Directive 99 conspiracy was completed. He then turned his attention to the cameras, knowing the world was watching, and echoed the sentiment that Judge Judy had been shouting from the rooftops: justice is not a calculation. It is a commitment. As we reach the conclusion of this extraordinary saga, we are reminded that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And sometimes that vigilance comes in the form of a 5-year-old boy and a judge who refuses to bow to the machine. If this story has moved you, if it has made you realize that one voice can indeed change the world, then I am asking you right now to be that voice. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with everyone who needs to remember that the law belongs to the people, not the bureaucrats. By joining our community, you are helping us shine a light into the darkest corners of the legal system, ensuring that no more invisible children are lost in the gears. Leave a comment below with the word Mateo to show that you stand for justice over politics. We are committed to following this case until every official involved in Directive 99 is held accountable, and we want you by our side for every step of that journey. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the revelation of Judge Judy's 3-word warning that had been whispered about since the trial began. It wasn't a complex legal threat. It was a moral ultimatum delivered with the force of a tidal wave. During a private meeting with the high-ranking officials who had tried to suppress the case, Judy had looked the lead director in the eye and said, "Check your soul." Those 3 words became the rallying cry for a movement. They weren't just a warning to the people in that room. They were a warning to every person in a position of power who has forgotten the human cost of their administrative decisions. Judy's intervention had stripped away the ivory tower protections of the federal bench and forced them to face the reality of their own coldness. The final scene in the courtroom was one of quiet, tearful restoration. As the federal block was made permanent, Mateo was led out of the courtroom, not by armed guards, but by Sarah Jenkins and a team of advocates who had fought for his right to exist. He stopped at the bench one last time and looked at Judge Miller. He didn't understand the directives, the algorithms, or the constitutional blind spots. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't being moved, he was being seen. Judge Miller nodded to the boy, a silent promise that the shield he had raised would never be lowered. The hunters had been defeated, the secrets had been exposed, and the boy who was supposed to be erased had instead become the architect of a new era of American justice. As the doors of the courtroom closed, the legacy of the Mateo case began to ripple across the country. It led to the immediate suspension of the automated sorting software and the resignation of 3 high-level directors. But more importantly, it restored the faith of millions of Americans who had begun to believe that the system was too broken to care. Judge Judy's reaction wasn't just a viral moment, it was a masterclass in accountability. She proved that when the law loses its heart, it loses its authority. The 3-word warning still echoes in the halls of Washington, a constant reminder that in the United States, we don't deport our humanity, we defend it. Mateo is no longer a case number. He is a reminder that even the smallest spark can start a fire that burns down a forest of lies. Thank you for standing with us, for seeking the truth, and for remembering that justice, real justice, always begins and ends with the dignity of a single human life. Court is adjourned.